Hello, welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I'm Carl. I'm back with Matt, Cameron, and Tim, probably. Uh, Tim probably Cox. I don't know. Anyway, we're talking about today probability, and this is going to have some overlap with our old statistics podcast. So if you haven't listened to that one, go back and do that, and then come here, and we'll fill in some holes and talk a little bit about some other probabilistic events that we didn't really discuss there. That was a little bit more about distributions and other statistical terms that were more specialized for that. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about the layman's interaction with probability and what we kind of think on a day-to-day level versus what probability theory and actually says about what events and how probability interacts with our day-to-day life. So let's start with a coin flip. We're all very familiar with flipping coins. And Tim, what is the probability of a heads?
I would say, well, I guess what you could say, I guess the odds would be, is it 1 out of 2? Would the probability be 0.5? Is that how it's measured?
I was just going to give a percent.
Okay, 50%.
A layman podcast, Tim. Come on.
Presuming you're not cheating.
Not a weighted or a two-headed, two-faced, whatever. Yes, 50%. Now, Cameron, have you ever flipped a coin a bunch of times, and do the outcomes always, do you always end up with even amounts of heads and tails?
No.
Wait, is that a no, you've never done it, or no, you don't end up with the same number?
I generally don't end up with the same number, but that is because when I flip a coin, I can generally make it be the side that I want it to be.
There are some tricks you can pull on it, but assuming you're not pulling any tricks and not doing anything untoward, yes, you're not going to end up with the same number, and that has a little more to do with distributions and stuff like that, and just sample size. But Matt, what is the probability on any given flip? Why does it always stay 50%?
So assuming that your coin is perfectly balanced and weighted, and no coin is, but let's just pretend, you'll always have a 50% chance that you'll get a heads and a 50% chance that you'll get a tails. And the reason is that any throw of the coin or flip of the coin is the result of that coin flip is completely independent of any actions that you've previously taken, any previous coin flips. Just because I threw heads on my last attempt, that has no bearing on whether or not I throw heads or tails on the next attempt. There is no physical connection between what was done and what will be done next. And that's because my potential sample size of coin flips is infinite. I can flip that stupid coin as many times as I want. And I have two possibilities. Each one of them is equally probable, heads or tails, 50%, 50%. Therefore, what you will see is over time, get about half of them heads, half of them tails, but the result for any given trial is totally independent of what came immediately before.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's important. And so there's a term actually. So the idea that that's not the case. The idea that you can get on a run. It's the gambler's fallacy, or I guess also known as the Monte Carlo fallacy. The idea that if you've observed that a particular coin is more likely to give you heads, then you can start betting heads essentially, and that's going to. But these are independent, like Matt said, independent throws, and we can establish that the probability does not depend on past events. It is independent of past events, and so this is the idea of future probability being independent of any previous results. So that's it's kind of counterintuitive to some extent. We all kind of get this feeling in life that, oh, I'm due, it's my turn, my luck's going to turn, but all future events are probably probabilistic according to their actual inputs, not past events. So
Yeah. Well, and there's a key thing that I think you're going to talk about in a minute. Future events where there is an infinite possibility of outcomes are totally independent. If you're dealing with a limited supply,
right,
then that changes. But we'll talk about that, I'm assuming, in a minute.
Yes, we'll do one other thing, and then we'll get on to that. So the other, once again, this is just an example of something I know that we all interact with kind of on a day-to-day. Either you can think of this either as a lightning strike or as a car accident. The idea that I haven't ever been in an accident, therefore I will not ever be in an accident, or I've never been struck by lightning, or I won't be struck by lightning. It's once again, it's the same idea, but once again, just that fallacy of these events are dependent on my past, not on the actual uh, conditions that contribute to the probability of that future event. So the probability of you being struck by lightning is actually independent of what has happened to you in the past. Is far more dependent on your location and whether or not you're outside or those types of things. Just because you've never been struck by lightning doesn't mean you will never be struck by lightning, or just because you've never been in a car accident doesn't mean you won't be in a car accident. Now, those things, there are conditions on those things, right? Like there are better drivers. For example, the probability that Tim gets a car accident significantly higher than the chance that I get in a car accident, right?
Only if I'm driving someone else's car.
I think you've wrecked your car as well, haven't you?
Well, I think you probably owned it at the time.
Yes, Tim, I think, has wrecked most people's cars, especially on this podcast. So,
yeah, but that does not mean that if we were all to get in a car and we chose Tim to drive, that we would be more likely to have an accident, right?
Well,
now here we jump into statistics and causality factors,
right,
and that's
exactly.
a little bit different. But.
Right. So yes, exactly. So essentially, the idea though is if I've ridden with Tim for a while and everything's gone well, the probability of me getting in the car with Tim next time and us everything going fine is an independent variable of that historical the historical facts. It's more an input of what kind of quality of Tim, the driver is Tim, and what roads are we driving on? Those types of things that actually condition the future event, as opposed to these events that I'm drawing on in the past. So, so that's
kind of time to mention that this podcast is sponsored by Allstate with accident forgiveness.
That's right.
Like a good neighbor, Allstate is there.
You just lost us that sponsorship.
Maybe State Farm. I don't know.
I don't think we can actually
sing jingles on our podcast. I think I don't know. That's fair use, maybe. I don't know. Okay.
Technically, I didn't use either company's jingle. Or.
Okay. Well, if we need representation, we've got a lawyer that's already been on our podcast, so we're good.
That would be a fun podcast, Carl, like the legal system from the inside.
We actually did a podcast about copyright. Do you remember that, Tim?
I do. But have we done a podcast about prison conditions?
I hope you cut this entire section.
You would like that, wouldn't you?
I would.
Okay, let's move on to what Matt was talking about just a minute ago. As far as there's the future probability where probable events are not dependent on past on historical events, and then there's probability as determined by when you're selecting what I call selection probability. So there's future probability and selection probability. Selection probability is if I'm selecting from a gumball machine and I want pink. If I don't get pink and I see pink in the gumball machine, I know my probability of getting pink the next time has now actually gone up. right? And so that's additional information that is an update in the system, that no longer is the system the same, and so the probability now changes, and that's how the selection from a finite number of options is different than future probability. Tim, you had something you wanted to share?
Well, it's kind of talking about the two of these things. I think sometimes our minds bleed our thinking about selection probability over into, what did you call the first one?
I call the
Independent
one, yeah, you can call it independent probability, or I just future probability, right?
future probability. Okay. So sometimes we tend to look at a future probability instance like a coin flip, or say the gender of a baby,
Right.
and think of it in terms of selection probability, right? So
Mhm.
for example, I have a sister who has 5 girls, and so when they were expecting their fifth, a lot of times thinking, as you've mentioned before, oh, they're due up for a boy. What are the odds of it? But of course, the selection is completely independent. This plays out sometimes in how we view randomization. One of my favorite stories about probability is a story about a professor teaching about randomization, who gives an entire classroom, tells everyone, okay, pull out a coin, and I want all of you to flip the coin 100 times and record your outcomes on a poster in order. And then she tells one person, you're not going to flip a coin. You're just going to, from your own mind, try to do a random assortment of heads and tails. And then she leaves the room for long enough for them to complete the task. And then she comes back into the room and she says, okay, and the person who didn't do the coin toss was this one. And she's able to identify it every time. And the trick to finding it is you look for the one that has the least number of long stretches of the same outcome in a row. Um, because our human minds, we tend to think, oh well, a random coin flip, that means that it's gonna, we're gonna say, okay, a heads here, a tails here, and it's gonna go back and forth a lot. If we see a lot of heads in a row, we tend to think, oh well, that's not random, but it actually is. In a 50-50 random series, it's actually not uncommon to have a long string of the same outcome. So, for example, my sister, who has 5 daughters, that's people think, well, is that really up to chance, or it can't be. What are the odds of 5 in a row? But actually, in among many people, that's not going to be uncommon, and but we tend to not think of that as random. And so when we have a playlist and we put it on shuffle, and the song that we just heard gets played again, 3 songs later, we get mad. We say, hey, what's going on? But if it's truly random, then that's an utterly possible result, because the outcome is not dependent on the previous songs, or whether it was played just 3 songs ago. I imagine that shuffling, randomization software probably takes that human expectation into account. And when we put our playlist on shuffle, we're not actually getting a true random sampling of songs.
Right. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but yeah, there's the idea that we'll talk a little bit more about random events, and what's actually random versus kind of pseudo-random versus deterministic. So those are all things we're going to discuss in just a minute. But yeah, that it is certainly kind of intuitive, and for the kids, and I guess most just people in general have this default of believing that it's more of a selection probability in life, right? Not that there are future events are, like we've already discussed, independent. Everything seems like it's probably a selection probability. So that's kind of often how we live our lives, even though that's counter to reality. So, Matt or Cameron, anything to add?
We could just all have really small playlists, and genetics, plays a big component in what child you'll have.
That is true. So I guess that's the other part of considering this is go back and listen to our calculus podcast, because honestly, which conditions influence the outcome of an event are important to consider, because yeah, it actually does matter. If you want to predict the probability of having a boy or a girl, it turns out that you look at the siblings of the father, and the father's siblings have more predictive power when it comes to predicting their children's gender than mother or mother's siblings. And so that according, at least from what I've read. So yeah, these conditions are interesting, and that often throws off I think our thinking as far as like these are largely probabilistic events, meaning they're not conditioned on what we think they're conditioned on. They're not. It's not I'm due. It's these are the actual conditions, and now roll the dice. Let's see, and the outcome will be what it is, determined by the actual inputs, not my historical um, events. Okay,
So
Matt.
you're saying the fact that I have 5 sisters and no brothers may actually be a factor in the fact that I have all daughters.
Yes, scientifically speaking, that is what I glean from what I've read. So.
Wow.
Yep.
And your father had a lot of sisters too.
That's true.
Yep. So that's the predictive power of actual variables that do influence these probabilistic events. And it turns out in life, most things are probabilistic events. Language, for example, I study linguistics. Most people think that's a very rules-governed thing. I know how to put my sentence together because I have rules in my head. And to some degree, that's true. But actually, as it turns out, a lot of those are analogy. And analogy is governed by probability. And so it turns out language is largely probabilistic. And so anyway, we can talk about that more later. But Matt, anything else to update about?
In most languages, bibliothèque is library.
Okay. Matt, anything to add about probability? This selection probability, I guess.
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, so let's talk about another, let's say, counterintuitive probability problem. Who's seen the movie 21? Anyone?
21 times.
So Cameron's seen it. Tim, Matt, I don't remember. Did you guys tell me that you'd seen it? Not seen it, right?
No, I haven't seen that one.
I know for a fact that Matt has seen it, but he probably just doesn't
Did we
remember.
watch it together?
Yeah,
we watched it together. Okay. Anyway, it's a movie about gambling. All right.
Got Kevin Spacey in it.
Right. Yep. So we don't speak his name. Yeah. Okay. So it's a movie about gambling, and at one point at the beginning of the movie, they introduced what's a pretty common, a well-known example of some of the confusion that comes from probability, and this is called the Monty Hall problem. And so this is a probability puzzle, and it's very, very, very counterintuitive. And this is, so let's say you're in a game show and you're given 3 doors, and behind one of these doors there's a prize. And so you pick one at random. So you pick number 1. And so now the game show host says, okay, I'm going to show you what's behind door number 3. And he opens up door number 3, and it's an old sock. So it's not the prize or whatever. And he says, okay, and now that you know what's behind door number 3, you've got doors number 1 and 2 left, your original selection, door number 1. Would you like to change your selection? At this point, most of us think, well, I'll stick with 1. That was my original pick. And so why would it not be any better than the other one? So we stick with the original, and we lose, because what it turns out, and this is so counterintuitive that this was mind-boggling, and people even well-educated people disagreed vocally and even in print. he said that the assumption is that the probability moves distributes evenly across the two doors that are left, when in reality the probability adds to the door that you did not pick. And so now if you pick the other door, if you move your selection from 1 to 2, your probability of winning is now jumped to 66%, not 50 like you would think, as you would think your first door was also 50. It's actually your first door, the one that you selected, you're now sitting on a 33% chance, whereas if you switch, you now have a 66% chance. And it turns out that is the case, and it blows my mind still. Yeah, I've read the whole Wikipedia page, and it is, yeah, I don't know how to explain it. It
I
says,
take back at explaining why.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, because I was actually reading about that before I looked up like fun facts about probability, which is a terrible thing to search, but that came up and I was like, how on earth? What's going on? Here's and Carl, you can tell me if this works or if this is the reasoning. When you chose door number 1, you had a 33% chance of selecting the prize. However, the host now is presented with a probability where he's got two doors remaining. One has the prize and one does not. So he has a 50-50 shot of eliminating the prize from those. So when he eliminates one, the one that's left has a 50-50 chance of being the one with the prize. So you either stick with door number 1 that you picked, which has a 33% chance of being right, or you switch to the other door, which has a 50% chance of being right. Is that the reason why the math works out that way?
It's here's the paragraph I think that explains why that's not. That's a good way of explaining it. I don't think it's quite right. It says most people come to the
That would
conclusion
make it a
switching.
bad way of explaining it.
Most people come to the conclusion that switching does not matter because there are 2 unopened doors in one car, or the prize, and that it's a 50-50 chance. This would be true if the host opens a door randomly, but that is not the case. The door open depends on the player's initial choice, so the assumption of independence does not hold. Before a host opens a door, there's a 1/3 probability. After the door is open, the probability goes. Well, it's okay. Let me read this carefully. If the door behind car 1, the host can open either door 2 or 3, so the probability the car is behind door 1 and the car opens door 3 is 1/6. If the car is behind door 2, the host must open door 3, so the probability the car is behind door 2 and the host opens door 3 is 1/3. These are the only cases where the host opens door 3. If the player has picked door 1 and the host opens door 3, the car is twice as likely behind door 2. Does that make sense? And that's the closest I got to understanding it. And it's essentially very close to what you said, Tim. I think the probabilities are slightly off, but that's a good way to understand it. Is your pick and his opening of the door are both updating probabilities, but they're updating not evenly because he is picking which door to open based on your selection. So
yeah, so when you're presented with a 50-50 switch after he's revealed a door, it's no longer we tend to think of it as these 2 doors have the same probability, but the probability has changed even though the doors haven't.
Right. Yeah,
that's
which,
really,
like I said, very counterintuitive, and worth spending the time to understand, because I think it helps you bend your mind around something that is useful. So, like I said, I've spent some time trying to figure it out, and I think at this point I understand it better for sure. So, okay, let's talk. So we've talked a little bit about gambling fallacy and this idea that we're due, and we kind of debunked those. Now, how about a hot hand in sports? Matt, any idea about whether or not a hot hand in sports is a fallacy, or whether or not that's a reality?
Well, when you say hot hand, I assume you're meaning
So that would be like basketball shooting, but you could imagine anything. Like if I'm hitting the baseball, if I'm on fire, if I've hit 5 out of the last 10 times I was up at bat, I'm going to be you know I'm going to be good for the next few at bats.
right. Yeah, that would definitely be a fallacy because, well, intuitively, I'm sure it is. But I'll leave it to you to explain why, because honestly, I don't know.
I'm going to say it. There's a little bit of both. It can be fallacious, applied fallaciously, but due to sports psychology, it's not always unfounded, um, because the person with the hot hand believes they have a hot hand, and that can
Right.
affect performance.
Exactly. So I've read articles that say essentially, yeah, it's not a real thing. But then I've read articles that control for other variables, and that say, look, it actually is a real thing, and they explain it essentially that way. The idea that, sure, the probability of me making a shot in basketball isn't actually dependent on my previous shots. However, the probability of me making a shot in basketball is dependent on my state of mind, my focus level, those types of things. And so if all of a sudden in one night, my focus level is significantly higher, or my, whatever it is, I ate a really good dinner or something, my nervous system, I put in something that was very calming, and therefore my hands are far more sure and steady than they are normally. Um, Actually, so you need to update that system. The system inputs have actually changed, and so while you would think it is a closed, it's a selection probability, or it is a future probability, and therefore independent of past events, it turns out that the model has updated, and therefore you have to do an update to the model. And so there is some, and I don't remember what the percentage was, but it is the case that there is some degree of hot hand reality in sports, specifically the idea that if I'm on, I'm on. And while that isn't it's related to the gambler's fallacy, but it is more it's a more complex system than the gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy, there is no update to the system, therefore the probability actually never changes, and it's just me perceiving that there's a change that causes that fallacy. Where in the hot hand in sports, I am part of the system, therefore me perceiving that there is this change in the system actually is a change in the system. And it's the idea of the confidence and obviously other potential inputs.
So
But
what
yeah,
I'm hearing is that if you're playing sports, all you have to do is believe in yourself.
you've seen all those Disney movies, right?
Wow, who knew they were actually... Okay, never mind.
That's right.
Feel the rhythm. Uh,
Now, this can be, I think it can be over applied and applied fallaciously.
there's no question. Yes.
Like if you've seen the movie Moneyball, I think that's a great example of statistics in sports and how. The premise for those of you who haven't seen Moneyball, it's about the Oakland A's in I think the 1980s, and basically it came in. Baseball is just soaked with tradition, and so you had all of these kind of methods of scouting and selecting, which statistics were given the most value and which weren't. And basically, these clever people with statistical know-how came in and said, actually, if we look at, carefully and with discretion using statistical, things, and I mean,
Actual
I,
indicators.
yeah,
Well, they identified the indicators that matter.
exactly. And they didn't always line up with the traditional indicators, and as a result, they were able to really maximize their bang for their buck and build a very successful team. bucking the trend now. And I mean, baseball has always been a statistically oriented sport, but now it's absolutely insane how much data there is, especially in the highest levels of baseball. So for example, they'll keep track of this batter's probability of getting a hit against this handed pitcher, kind of pitcher, with runners on this base and that base, and all sorts of things. It's pretty pretty heavy duty. So
Right.
That one won the Oscar for best statistics in 1980, whatever it was when it was released.
that's right, a very coveted award.
Yes.
Released in the early 2000s.
Don't ruin Matt's beautiful lie.
And the movie was based in the 90s because they took the person from the Oakland A's, and that's how the Sox won the pennant.
No, that's right. And statistics didn't exist in the 1980s, so that makes sense.
If you look at music videos from the 1980s, I would totally believe that. Apparently, a lot of things didn't exist. My goodness.
Oh my. Okay. Well, we've really gone in a direction I wasn't expecting us to go here. So.
Odds were slim.
Okay, let's move on to one other topic I wanted to touch on here before we wrap up. Okay, so and this is random, the random events, random variables, and I think there's some confusion, and I know that I think conceptually understand what random means, but when we're trying to define it, I think sometimes it gets a little complicated. But a random event essentially is just an unpredictable event, right? Versus a deterministic event, or so. For example, if I go to weigh myself right now, and I stand on the scale, and it says whatever it's going to say. Let's say 100 and who cares? 100 pounds. Let's say I'm an incredibly small person. I stand on the scale that says I'm 100 pounds. I get off, and now I'm going to stand on the scale again. Is it a random event? Is the next number going to say 1,500? No. That's a deterministic event. My weight is what I'm measuring, right? However, a random event is like what we've already discussed here. So flipping a coin, rolling dice, and so that is something that is unpredictable, not based on that past event. I can predict my weight based on me weighing myself 1 minute ago. I cannot predict my dice roll based on a dice roll I did 1 minute ago. So that's the idea of a random event. And that does not mean, however, that random events cannot be assigned probability, and that's what we do. That's how we, I guess, control our reality out there, because it turns out there are a lot of random events that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And so we assign probability to particular events, and we are constantly updating that because these random events give us more information. But let's take the example. So this, I found this online. So it says you can kind of predict. This is you're trying to get the probability of any random event. So, for example, if there's 76% of Americans support universal health care, what is the probability that a randomly selected group of 3 people will all be in favor of universal health care? So in that case, you've got 76%, so 0.76. And so if you're trying to figure out what the probability is that any 3 people from are all in agreement here, you said repeat. So you just multiply that probability by itself that number of times, so 3 times. So you time 0.76 times 0.76 times 0.76. That is the probability of the random event of finding 3 people on the street, picking them all out and saying, well, do you agree with this stance? The chance that they're all going to agree, if the underlying probability is 76%, is 0.4, essentially 44% probability that I'm going to pick 3 random people out of the population, and they will all agree on this point. And so once again, it's just the idea that probability in that case is you multiply these together to get the probability of that random event. But random events go across the board as far as once again, outside of dice rolls and things like that, we already talked about, like language, what word I'm going to say next, and so some of these are systems we're far more familiar with being able to predict probability for, and some are significantly less. But these random events are it's good to know how to calculate probability over these events. And let's take, for example, the idea, once again, this deterministic idea, a computer. So, and it helps us kind of also differentiate random versus deterministic. So inside of a computer, you have, right, just deterministic stuff. These are all bits, and they all, everything in there can be measured at any point, and you know it, and it exists in that state. And so any input will just, you can measure that, and therefore it still exists in the state that you know you've measured. So it would seem to be a deterministic system. However, computers can essentially observe what is a non-deterministic system, or a probabilistic or random event outside, and use it to generate random numbers. So if you were wondering whether or not computers can do random numbers, and we discussed earlier, Tim was talking about random shuffling of a playlist, for example. And often computers will use kind of pseudo-random if they don't want to have to, because it's easier to kind of pseudo-random, where you're essentially just using a complicated little algorithm to spit out a number. However, if they just observe a mouse movement, well, guess what? That's random, right? Which direction I'm going to move my mouse is random. And so if an event uses that as an input in a algorithm, it can then say, oh, here's a random number. Or if it observes, it can use a clock actually in certain ways to also generate a random number. So there are ways that essentially you can get a random number from what would seem to be a deterministic system. However, there are, let's take once again another example, humans. Matt, would you imagine that humans are deterministic or random?
Oh, I'd say it's a strange question.
It is probably.
At some level, I think there are deterministic qualities of our behavior, is how I would phrase it.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Firmly believe you can choose any number of things. Subconsciously in particular, though, I think you'll find a bunch of things that could be deterministically predicted for any given person.
Right. Yeah. So, for example, yes, and I think that's true. We humans can decide, and so in that way, it seems like it's very deterministic. Now, probability, that does not mean that we cannot assign probabilities to what humans do, and like we would a random event. But as the human ourselves, we have some deterministic value over our own system. However, for example, let's say generating a random number. If I ask Cameron or Tim here to generate a random number of a particular length, let's say I want you to generate an 8-digit random number, and I want you to do it 20 times. They would do it, and they would do it successfully in their minds. They would be able to come up with an 8-digit number 20 times. However, it turns out that those numbers that they would generate would be predictable to some extent. It's not entirely random. It wouldn't follow the distribution you'd imagine from a truly random event. It would actually, there would be some bias involved, and that's entirely subconscious bias. It's not like they're thinking, let me pick one more. It's my favorite number. It's subconscious, but humans have a particular way that we generate numbers, and once again, not something that we can observe inside of ourselves, but as we generate these random numbers, it turns out that computer models can predict, oh, actually, this is not a random system. They're using this underlying bias, this underlying generation system that has these more predictable results. And so that's an example of how we can be unknowingly somewhat deterministic. And so these things, yeah, sometimes lie beyond our conscious mind's ability to observe. And I've read Malcolm Gladwell's what's that?
Blink.
Does anyone? There's a book. It's about the dog. Not the dog walked. Does anyone know what book I'm talking about here?
The Tipping Point. Blink.
Blink. It's Blink.
Okay.
That's the one. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
You bet.
And Blink talks about how, often our underlying systems, essentially inside of our mind, have this ability to predict events, and that we have no idea that we could predict, because we are constantly updating models. We have predictive power inside of ourselves that we're not even aware of, because of all these inputs that we can use. And so we're a very complex system. So what Matt's answer was originally, as far as some deterministic, is entirely true, but it's hard for ourselves to be able to introspect to that level often and be able to figure out what our probabilities are in particular areas. But some degree of human activity probably does follow a random model. That's not generally the case.
If I could opine on randomness and our perception of it and problems that we sometimes run into, I think sometimes we can get into trouble when we presume or assume randomness when it's actually not. And I'll give two examples. So if I'm doing a study or conducting a survey or something, I'll do my best to capture whatever percentage of the population and try to make it random. But it's actually really hard to get a truly random sampling of a population. So sometimes when we see polls come out or studies or surveys and they'll give results, sometimes some results will be more accurate than others. You see this a lot around election times, and people wondering, oh, that came out of nowhere. How did we not see that? Well, it's really hard for pollsters to actually get a truly random sampling that really illustrates what's going on in the world. Sometimes this can play the other way too. For example, Carl, I think you gave a statistic about such and such number of people support universal health care or whatever. Sometimes we can give our own experience a heavier weight. So for example, I might hear that stat and say, well, that's not true, because 9 out of 10 people that I know hate the idea. Or maybe I go the other way and I say, that's not true. I hardly know anyone who doesn't like that idea. But I'm not, we sometimes don't in our experience recognize that what we observe is not a truly random situation. So for example, I'm filtering my experience through my tastes in the friends that I choose, through the region that I live in, through my occupation, my ethnicity, my faith, and all of these things can affect my my lived experience. And so sometimes I see this in our national discourse, where people will just not believe things that are shared in the community, statistics and that kind of thing, because they don't jive with what they observe one way or the other. And we make the fallacy of presuming that our vision or our lived experience is maybe a more balanced or valid representation of reality than the statistic. And anyways, I'm not saying we should believe all statistics that are put out there or all studies are equal, but I think those who make the studies and those who read them, we all have to recognize that true randomness is hard to achieve, and our lived experience can taint our our perception of randomness.
Yeah. This kind of goes back to I think we were revisiting some of the stuff that we talked about in the statistics podcast, but that's okay because that was a good podcast too. This we're talking about essentially just the complexity of systems, and it turns out as you throw in more and more and more variables, yes, it's very difficult to predict things, and that once again goes back to our calculus podcast as well. But if you can get a small enough system, then this probability theory becomes very important to understand. But yes, as you broaden things out to yes, politics and family and human events, and then all of a sudden you're adding in all of these variables that are impossible to control for, and therefore this probability theory of being able to say, okay, what's the probability that the prize is behind door one is so foreign to these other events that it doesn't even seem like it is the same system, the same algorithms can be used to predict both of them. So but it is useful to know them and to understand that by controlling a system very well, you can start applying these rules better, more uniformly, and understanding, just these fallacies, the idea of the gambler's fallacy, and the additive probability versus future probability, which is independent of history. It's a good point. So as you go day to day, your models of reality and the probability you assign things can be very messy, and keep an open mind. But once understand these principles of probability, so that you understand how these systems work and what the rules are in these control systems, in order to better understand how probability and statistics work in general.
And in all things, when in doubt, just check with Learn It From a Layman.
That's right. I did want to thank our listener base. We are growing, and we have all 50 states that are listening to us. Let's see, the UK, Australia, Canada, India, all showing up in large numbers. So appreciate our listeners around the world, though. Spread the word. We are going to be doing lots of our history podcasts are not particularly well received. I'll blame Tim. I think that's Tim's fault. Right,
That
Tim?
is my actual obligation. So,
but the science podcast
advertise that one of our genres is underperforming. But
well, our listeners, those are good podcasts. I'm just saying that the people haven't found them yet. So if you want more of our content, go listen to our history podcast. Because what, Cameron?
I see what you're doing. Sorry about that.
What was Cameron? Were you saying something?
No.
Oh, I think it might have been me. I was just saying you were appealing to everyone's, root for the underdog impulse.
Right. We'd like to finish up that series, but right now our listener base is moving us far more in the area of more physics, and calculus and math and statistics, and so we'll be trying to do some combination, and we'll see what the next podcast brings. Probably it will be a good one. So until then, thanks for listening, and we'll be back again